Round number 8 of the Candidates Tournament 2016. Today I'm going to take a look at the game Fabiano Caruana against Hikaru Nakamura, an all-American duel. So let's get right into it. Caruana with the white piece starting with e4, and Nakamura is going for the Berlin defense with knight f6, and Caruana chooses to go for anti-Berlin. In the past he has played the Berlin endgame a lot, but today he decides to not play and go for d3, and he had something specific in mind here. Now bishop c5, is one main move, the other main move is to go d6, but Nakamura chooses to put the bishop in front of the pawn chain, bishop c5, and now bishop takes c6. d takes c6 and knight bd2. Just in case you're wondering, white could take on e5, but would not lead to any advantage. There's queen d4 hitting both pawn on f2 and knight on e5, and then bishop e3. White wouldn't lose a piece, but probably would end up in a pretty bad position here. So yeah, this is no good actually. This is really bad for white. So knight takes e5 doesn't work. So knight bd2, castle, and queen e2, and white is preparing the queenside castle indeed, which is adding a lot more spice to the position. If white castles kingside, that's very quiet and not a lot going on, but whenever you have opposite castled positions, so both sides castle in opposite directions, then of course there can be attacks. So this makes it much more interesting. Queen e8, rook e8, excuse me, knight c4, knight d7. The typical maneuvers here, the knight is not that well placed on f6, so it maneuvers to better squares and also protects the pawn e5 right now. Bishop d2, and now bishop d6. Same is true for a bishop. Bishop is moving out of the way in case black wants to play c5 at some point, or knight c5. And the bishop now protects the pawn on e5 as well. And now queenside castle, which is almost a novelty. It has been played before, but only once. In the London Chess Classics just last December, Anand played g4 against Giri in this game. Or maybe not the London Chess Classics, excuse me. Somewhere else. Bilbao it says, not quite sure. Anyways, g4 is also interesting and keeping the king for now in the center, but Caruana had prepared this variation, queenside castle, and later continuing with the advance of the kingside pawns. Now b5, and Nakamura goes directly for pushing his own pawns on the queen side, and this makes a lot of sense. Knight e3 and a5, because really this is going to get down to who's faster, who's better in launching the attack, because the center is closed and it will remain closed since black has no good way to open it and white will not open it with d4. And once the center is closed, you have to play on the wings or sides of the board, so queenside or kingside. Knight f5, and Nakamura just continues here, a4. Now bishop g5 is a pretty good move, I think. The whole point is that it provokes f6, and now the bishop retreats to e3. So white has kind of created a target here and allows white to open the black king position earlier with g4, g5, and then for example taking on f6, and that's exactly what happens in the game, more or less. And this is something to keep in mind as a general rule of thumb. Don't move pawns on the side that you're weaker unless you have to. So in this case black had to move a pawn in front of his own king, but this slightly weakened his king position, and the whole reason is the other side, in this case white, is a little bit faster in opening up the position. So general rule of thumb, don't move pawns on the side you're weaker at. So now knight c5. And here this was the first moment where I was wondering if maybe keeping another defending piece on the king side would have been better or maybe more appropriate. It's not clear, because as we see the game progressing, it's not that easy to really pinpoint exactly where it all went wrong for Nakamura. So I looked pretty all in. Here knight of 8 seems like a good idea. g4, bishop e6, king b1, this is exactly how it happened in the game, and if now queen d7 maybe to exacerbate g5, because then black could just take on f5 twice. Now rook hg1, and knight g6, and sometimes black can think about putting a knight on f4, forcing an exchange. It would be a completely different position that was in the game. Just a different story. Alright, so in the game Nakamura goes knight c5, obviously keeping the knight closer to the white king than to its own king. g4, bishop e6, king b1, defending the pawn on a2. And now b4. Once again, maybe queen d7, just some prophylactic moves here on black's part could have been helpful. Again, g5 wouldn't be a good idea now, because black could just win this pawn. So white would prepare g5, rook hg1. Now maybe another prophylactic move, getting the king out of the g file, king h8. And it seems maybe that white is forced to take on d6 here first and then play g5, but this certainly would help black, because obviously the black pawn structure is repaired now, but at the same time still white will be able to open the g file, and it is certainly still a double-edged position. So Nakamura goes b4, just continues on to attack. And now g5. And now Nakamura goes b3. He just ignores the whole king side. Instead, king h8 was another possible move. Again, just moving out of the g file. And if rook hg1 now, then bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and a3. And why a3? Well, white has to react with b3 pretty much, otherwise black could open up the a file by taking on b2. And then black can play e4. Now we see the whole point of inserting the moves a3 and b3. Now white cannot take on e4 because the knight would come quite powerfully to c3, and this would mean great trouble for white. So instead white would need to move the knight, let's say, to d4, and the position still remains highly complex. For example, f takes g5, and then white can continue sacrificing here with h4. I don't know what's going on. Really unclear. But I think to remain flexible by playing king h8 first, which is a move black wants to play anyway, and not deciding yet whether to go a3 or b3 would have been a good alternative here. That being said, there's nothing wrong with b3. Now rook hg1, and now b takes a2. Another move here was g6, which is of course not necessarily a move you would like to play. Again, we have this rule, don't make moves in front of your own king. But it was possible. Knight h6, and now king h8, and a3 seems to be a good move here for white to not open this a file. And this is again pretty unclear, but it looks white is slightly better here. For example, bishop f8, and now simply knight g4. And in many variations, in case you're wondering, white can sacrifice simply the exchange here, because the black pawns are so weak, and white would have good compensation here. But again, really wild and unclear, to me at least. But Nakamura goes b takes a2, king a1, now takes on f5, gets rid of this strong knight on f5. And now he goes a3, which is a move I don't like. And in the following, really his attack just stops. And at the same time the white attack is continuing. So instead, once again this move, useful move, king h8, move out of the g file. And now probably d4 is white's best choice. E takes d4 and rook takes d4, and once again highly unclear to me. Knight e4, and now queen c4, and now a3, insert a3, b3, and then queen e7. And here it is a slightly different situation now that white has played d4, because it allows black to more easily maybe create threats on a long diagonal against the white king. But still, I would rather take white here, most likely. But at the same time, everything can happen. But I think really after a3 it kind of goes downhill for Nakamura, because white plays b3, and now it's just not easy for black to continue the attack. Nakamura was kind of relying on knight a6 here, which we'll come to in a moment. Again, king h8 seemed to be still the best chance here, in which white might actually transpose the position we just saw by playing d4. So king h8 was still possible here, but knight a6, maybe this is like the last string more or less for Nakamura, because here after c3, which is an excellent move I think, white just has everything under control with these pawns in the center, and just now can continue his own attack, while black really doesn't have any counterplay. The whole point of c3 was to, I believe, prevent bishop b4 from happening. So that was the whole point, or maybe also knight b4 from happening, both these moves. And c3 just takes us out of the position, and the king will find a safe spot on a2. And now white is threatening his own moves on the g file. So bishop f8, knight d2, a nice regrouping of the knight to e4, which is a perfect square for a knight in this position. F takes g5, rook takes g5, knight c5. Now simply rook g3, good move, retreating with the rook, preparing to exchange this knight on c5. And white is not very afraid of going into this endgame, because here white is also pretty much just winning. Knight e4, threatening knight f6. Still, apparently, this was black's best chance, but considering this, it already tells you that if this is black's best chance, then things already went fairly wrong. Instead, Nakamura goes e4, tries to open up the position somehow to get to a white king, but it just doesn't work. Bishop takes c5, just eliminating this knight. Bishop takes c5, and now, well, rook d1 was a good move here, but there's nothing wrong with just picking up the pawn. Knight takes e4. The knight is, of course, very strong on e4. There's some ideas of knight f6 or f6. It's just too much, way too much going on here, while the white king is so safe on a1. Bishop d6, rook h3. This also brings in some new ideas here, for example bringing the queen, or maybe sacrificing the rook on h7. And white puts one rook on h3 and the other rook on g1. Bishop e5, not simply d4, and white doesn't care too much about this pin, because at the very least could always give a check on c4 and also protect his knight if necessary with f3, so really not a big deal. Rook g1, And White is just simply improving his position and creating threats. Sooner or later, Rook b8, and now just very calmly, King takes a2, all the time in the world for White here. Taking the pawn, protecting this one, nothing to worry about here. And the position is just completely gone. Black's almost running out of moves here too. For example, Queen d5 would be a move you would like to play to create some kind of play against this pawn, but of course this runs into knight takes f6. King h8 is another move you would like to play, maybe to prepare Queen d5, but here White just plays Queen h5 and h6 just takes, and this is checkmate. I have to blow my nose because this is getting out of control. Okay, so this doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, Queen e7, another move, just Rook e3, now threatening knight takes f6. And maybe the best try was c5, and then Queen c4 check, just picking up this pawn as well. And then White is already up 2 pawns, continues to attack, and it is over. Nakamura tried bishop h4, but that's just hopeless too. I don't. Maybe his threat was to go Queen d5 now. Yeah, I guess so. Maybe, I don't. Queen d5 doesn't even seem like a threat. Oh no, it is. It would be a threat against knight and pawn on b3. But White just plays a multi-purpose move here. Rook g4, protecting the knight on e4 and attacking the bishop on h4, and that's it. Last moves were Queen d5 and then c4, covering of course against the attack on b3, and Nakamura resigned because after Queen takes d4 White would just pick up the bishop and there are no checks or attacks or any kind of threats. Rook takes e4 would of course be answered by Rook takes e4, not Queen takes e4, that would run into checkmate, and that's easy enough. And there's really no kind of tricks or anything going on anymore, so Nakamura just said, okay, let's call it a day here. So really strong game by Caruana, who to my mind didn't give Nakamura much of a chance here. Good opening preparation it seemed from Caruana, preparing this line with queenside castling, and then this subtlety playing bishop g5 to provoke f6 to be able to later open up the g file. And then Nakamura didn't really find the right way to create his own attack, or rather I feel like he didn't spend enough time to defend his own position, and then it was just very smooth play by Caruana and quite comfortable win. So that puts Caruana on +1 now on 4.5 out of 8, so that means he's still in the run for winning this tournament, while Nakamura's back on -2 and will be much more difficult for him now to get back on track and still get the first place. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and see you again soon. Goodbye.